The church smelled of lilies and old hymnals. Evelyn had practiced smiling for days, a careful small curve that made people comfortable and left no space for questions. She kept the funeral program folded in her lap like a thin shield. The minister's voice rose and fell with the trained softness of someone who has said goodbye to hundreds. Around Evelyn, faces she'd loved all her life were a sea of blurred grief. Her daughter Mara with a hand on her throat, her brother Jonah pinching his eyes shut, distant cousins clutching tissues like talismans. James's photograph on the easel showed him the way she remembered him, cheek creased by a laugh he had always tried to hide. Halfway through the reading, warm and slow, something vibrated against Evelyn's thigh. Her phone was tucked into the inside pocket of her coat. She almost ignored it. There were too many goodbyes and too many aching eyes. But then it vibrated again, insistent. She slipped a thumb under the program and checked the screen. A single message, no name, no number. I am still alive. Trust no one. The words seemed to hang in the air like steam. For a second, the chapel felt unreal. The organ stopped. The minister's voice turned thin, and someone 2 rows behind her hissed, "Evie!" Her hands went cold. She read the message again, foolishly, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into sense. They did not. She felt the cheap bouquet in her lap droop as if it had been struck alongside her. She looked for the sender. Unknown. Blocked. The room felt too small all at once. People leaned toward her, steadying in the rituals of sympathy. Her daughter's eyes found hers, bright and terrified. Evelyn imagined James, his rough palms, the freckles on the inside of his wrist, alive somewhere, and a terrible, ridiculous hope rose in her like a tide. The minister cleared his throat and asked the congregation to bow their heads. Evelyn could not breathe. The decision arrived like a tide, and in it she heard the faint, distant echo of James's low voice saying once, years ago, "If you ever think I'm lying, Evie, you come and dig." Her fingers tightened on the program as the chapel buzzed with the sudden small electric of gossip. She folded the phone away, said a small prayer she did not feel, and for the first time in her life thought she might not be burying James at all. The florist's ribbons rustled as mourners shuffled toward the receiving line. Evelyn moved through them like someone underwater, watching people's mouths form condolences she didn't trust. In the hallway, someone tried to hug her. She let them, then stepped away, the message dull and bright in the inside pocket that had once held James's coins. She had to know. That single sentence could not be a trick, not at his funeral. James had been steady. He'd not joked like that. He didn't hide things just to cause trouble. Her hands found her car keys. The cold metal steadied her. She didn't tell Mara. How could she explain leaving a funeral? She didn't want the pitying looks, the whispers about a widow's odd behaviour. She slipped out the back door, past the choir still lingering to fold their robes, and felt absurdly guilty for walking away mid-saying of psalms. The chapel's doors closed behind her like a lid. She started the engine and drove without a destination, the message replaying in the quiet of the car. She pulled into the old lot behind Tompkins' pharmacy and opened the glove compartment. James's old tobacco tin sat there, a relic of the man who'd never thrown anything away. Under the lid was a folded scrap of paper she remembered James tucking into his coat months ago. Nothing fancy, a receipt, a note, a list of small things. She unfolded it now with a trembling hand. There, in James's small slanted handwriting, were 2 words. Willow 17. Her heart jackknifed. Was it a coincidence? The message had no other instruction. Willow 17 was an address on the far side of town, an old boatyard where James liked to take his radio and tune it to silence. The scrap smelled faintly of oil and tea. Evelyn sat with the steering wheel pressed into her palms, a small, stubborn determination building. She could go back into the chapel and play the part of the grieving widow. People would pity, they would watch her. Or she could go where the scrap suggested and see if the universe was cruel or making some strange late attempt at mercy. She drove. At Willow 17, the gate was chained, the paint flaking like old paper. She circled to the back and found a narrow service door left unlocked. Inside, the smell of seawater and rust greeted her, and against the far wall, wrapped in an old tarp, was a case she recognised, James's violin case he'd not used in years. Her fingers worked the latches with the clumsy delicacy of someone opening a present in the dark. The lid creaked. Inside, among Rosie and an old wrinkled sock, was a small brown envelope addressed in a hand she loved. To Evie. If anything, the rest was torn out. A gasp escaped her like a child's. Someone had read this and taken the rest. A paper with a phone number, a hurried scrap of a note, and a small brass key lay beneath the torn edge. She slid the key into her palm and felt the edges of the truth, and of betrayal, beginning to cut. When she turned, there was no one in the dark corner. Just a sliver of light from the boatyard door and the hush of gulls. Still, Evelyn felt watched. She wrapped the envelope and key into her coat and slipped back to the car, every shadow a possible witness. She called Mara and told her she would be a little late. Mara's voice sounded distant, like a person talking through water. "Stay with Aunt June," Mara said, voice brittle. "Don't go looking for trouble." But Evelyn's feet had already begun to carry her toward trouble. At home, she spread the contents on the kitchen table under the yellow lamp that used to be James's reading light. The torn edge of the note flirted with a single sentence scrawled by a hand that trembled. "If they take the ledger, go to the bank box." Key 47. Her head swam. James had never cared about bank boxes. He'd sung in pubs, fixed radios, and paid cash for most things. Why a ledger? Why a bank? A memory came, unexpected and bright. James at the sink, hands deep in soapy water, telling a younger Evelyn how once, when he'd worked nights in the warehouse, a man had offered him a packet of money to sign a paper that smelled of perfume. James had refused, with his usual stubborn pride. "Never liked the smell of perfume near money," he'd said with a wink. The present seemed to smell the same, like trouble wrapped in someone else's polish. Evelyn took the small brass key to the bank that afternoon. The woman at the counter peered at her over bifocals. "You need to fill a form," she said, slow and patronising. Evelyn signed, hand steady now. She opened a locker marked 47. Inside, a neat ledger, a folder of printed spreadsheets, and one slim hard drive wrapped in bubble wrap. The ledger was not a family recipe book or notes about songs. It was accounts. Names and numbers, transfers to a firm called Aurora Holdings, payments traced to a hospital, payments to a funeral director, and one column with handwritten initials, VS, the same initials on the back of more than one cheque. Her stomach lurched. VS was a name in the family. Vincent Shaw, her sister-in-law's husband, a man who smiled too much at the wrong times. As she held the ledger, someone banged on the bank door like a fist into her chest. "Miss! Miss!" A bank guard looked in, eyes flicking past her. He closed the door gently as if not to break more than glass. Evelyn folded the ledger into the folder and slid it into her bag. The world felt smaller and colder. Someone wanted this hidden. Someone had already worked to bury the truth. She thought of the funeral chapel and the minister's soft voice. "Trust no one," the message had said. She realised with a painful clarity that the message wasn't just a phantom's tease, it was an order. Back at the funeral home, the director, a man named Harold, had been helpful that week in a way that made Evelyn uneasy after finding the ledger. He'd assured her on the phone, voice slick with practised softness, that everything was arranged. When she returned to the chapel that evening under the pretence of retrieving James's watch, Harold's smile thinned. He'd kept the watch safe, he said, explaining carefully how easy it had been to misplace things when families were distracted. She asked about payments. He shifted his weight like a rabbit. "Everything was handled," he said, words clumsy now. Evelyn saw the ledger behind his desk, half slid into a file. A plastic coffee cup sat nearby with a lipstick stain. Her throat tightened. Harold's fingers fumbled with a paperclip. "Who paid you?" she demanded, gentle then sharp. He looked at her hands, at the old brass key she now held, as if the key was a relic of bad luck. You shouldn't be poking around, Harold said finally, voice small. It's not for you. Evelyn's pulse hammered. Who paid the extra? She asked. He blinked. Extra? He was lying. Ledger entries had shown a series of payments labelled arrangement fee, with a figure matching the funeral cost Evelyn had signed for. Who paid the extra? She pressed. He swallowed. Harold's face crumpled like an old napkin. He looked away, finally uttering a name she'd been dreading. Samuel Pierce. The name hit like a thrown stone. Samuel worked with James. They'd been friendly, but always careful. Samuel's laugh had been the sort that slipped easily into rooms like perfume. Harold's eyes darted to the window. They paid me to expedite things. They said it would be cleaner this way. His voice trembled. They wanted the ledger taken care of. Evelyn sat down hard. Who's they? She whispered, though the ledger's handwriting had already told her enough. Vincent. Mara's husband was tight with them. Harold's hands shook as he pushed a tissue into her palm. He had always been kind, and now his kindness looked like cowardice. The guilt that swelled in Evelyn was twofold: anger at those who had engineered her grief, and a naked, deflating realization that the people she'd trusted in certain corners of her life were ordinary people who could be bought. As she left the funeral home, Harold called after her in a voice so small she almost didn't hear it. Miss, be careful. Outside, a black sedan idled at the curb. The driver glared through the windshield, then looked away. Evelyn's hands went to her bag and the ledger inside it. The world felt warmer only in the places where James's memory lived. Everywhere else it felt like a stage rigged to collapse. Mara met Evelyn at the kitchen table with a coffee cup-like armour. Her face had been made up with the quick, practised hands of someone who had learned to hide fear behind everyday tasks. Evelyn placed the ledger on the worn table. Mara glanced at it, now pale, then put a hand over it as if to keep it safe. Where did you get this? She asked, voice small and brittle. From the beginning, Mara had been protective of the family image. She worked hard to keep things tidy, to fold away the messy truths, because she wanted normalcy for her little boy. She loved James. She loved him in her own complicated ways. But when Evelyn told Mara about the message, the one that claimed James was still alive, Mara's face hardened into a defence. Evie, you can't go making trouble, Mara said. At the funeral, people will talk. They'll think we're mad. They'll tear the family apart. Evelyn looked at her daughter as if seeing a map. In Mara's hands she saw a series of compromises, small ones made to keep peace. Did you know about any of the payments? Evelyn asked gently. Mara's jaw clicked. She shook her head. No, if you think Vincent... She didn't finish. The name was heavy in the room, unsaid yet everywhere like an odour. Mara put her hands over her face. Dad's gone, Evie. We have to do the service. We have to move on. Evelyn thought of James's voice calling from another time. If you have to move on with truth at your feet. She wanted to reach across the table and take Mara's hands and show her the ledger, the video file, the torn note. She wanted to tell her that grief did not need tidy. But before she could speak, Mara's phone chimed. She glanced at the screen and stiffened. It's Vincent, she said, swallowing. He says he's at the office. He wants me to sign the estate papers this afternoon. The word sign hung like a bell. Sign away everything and the trail would be gone. Evelyn's stomach turned. Don't sign anything, she said, low and urgent. Mara's eyes flashed a hurt that was almost accusation. You think I'd sign away Dad? She said. She was trying to protect their small family in a way Evelyn once had, but the ledger said otherwise. Evelyn remembered James in the nights when he had whispered, If they ever come for the papers, don't be polite. Now polite felt like a trap. The options tightened. Fight and risk losing what little normalcy Mara had, or fold and let the ledger disappear into some quiet corporate account. Outside, a lawnmower trundled along the neighbour's yard, its steady, mindless hum a mockery of the chaos inside Evelyn's kitchen. Mara picked up her cup as if it might anchor her. Evelyn's decision sparked like catching a match. She reached for Mara's hand. "We will not sign," she said quietly. "Not until we know what James wanted. Not until I know the truth." Mara's lips trembled, but she did not pull away. The house seemed to breathe around them. On the table, the ledger lay like a small slumbering animal, dangerous if provoked, necessary for survival. They went to the family lawyer with the ledger tucked beneath Evelyn's coat like contraband. Mr. Granger's office smelled of leather and old ink. He had been James's lawyer for years and had shepherded small estates with the practiced hands of a man who loved order. His smile at the door was a professional thing. His eyes, when Evelyn set the ledger on his polished desk, flicked in a way that told Evelyn he was measuring her for a small, hospitable lie. "Evelyn," he said, careful. "Come in." He asked to see the death certificate, as if it were the most important paper on earth. Evelyn pushed the ledger toward him. The lines of names, the transfers. Granger scanned it slowly, his fingers tapping the table. Then he did something Evelyn hadn't expected. He paled. The white around his mouth thinned as he whispered the name of a company she'd seen in the ledger, Aurora Holdings. "This is unexpected," he said. He neatly placed the ledger in a folder and closed it like a book he did not want to open. Evelyn watched him. "Who benefits?" she asked. "Who arranged the payments?" He gave her a practiced smile. "These matters are complicated, Evie," he said. He told her the usual things. There would be paperwork, probate, signatures. He leaned forward with the kind of gravity lawyers use to soothe wounds. "I will handle it. Best not to make hasty accusations." But his hands were too busy smoothing the folder, as if making it look tidy could make reality polite. Evelyn felt the old, small spark of distrust James had sometimes teased out of her, the iron that made her instinctively watch a man's hands. She left with promises and the nagging feeling of being steered into calm waters. In the car, she found the sealed envelope she had asked Mara to find in the locked drawer. James's handwriting labelled it, "If anything happens to me, for Evie only." Her fingers were clumsy as she slipped the seal, careful not to rip the thread of his voice. Inside, a list of names, numbers, and a single instruction in short, clean script. "If I am taken, the ledger is to be made public. Trust Amina at the station. She'll know what to do." A name she'd never heard before. Detective Amina. And then beneath that, in the smaller, more anxious hand James used when worried, "If Amina is compromised, trust the violin case. Don't trust the man in the suit." Granger's car pulled away from the curb like a man leaving a stage. Evelyn watched it go and felt a tightening coil of dread. She had looked to the law for order. Instead, she had been handed the quiet shuffle of excuses. James had prepared. He had left instructions because he had expected someone would come to take the ledger. He had expected treachery. Evelyn's sorrow curdled into cold purpose. She would find Amina. She would make the ledger public if she had to stand on the town square and shout the names. But first, she would follow the one instruction James had left. Find Amina. Detective Amina's voice was calm over the phone, the kind of voice that had returned dozens of frightened calls to sleep. When she agreed to meet, it wasn't because Evelyn was a well-known client. It was because something in James's name opened doors in a way Evelyn had not expected. Amina met Evelyn outside the station under a pale sky that had the look of weather waiting to happen. She wore no uniform, only a plain coat and eyes that had seen truth ugly and familiar. Evelyn showed her the ledger. Amina's fingers traced the entries as if reading a map. "This is deliberate," Amina said, grave and precise. "Someone moved money where someone else could claim it, and someone wanted James out of the way quickly." She told Evelyn about ambulance logs that had no export for the time the hospital claimed they took James in, about a security camera that had gone dark for 20 minutes outside the ward. Either someone cut the feed or a storm took it out, Amina muttered, but Evelyn watched the way her jaw tightened. She believed in mysteries the way Evelyn believed in bread. It was basic, necessary. She asked for the ledger and Evelyn held it like a child would a precious stone. "I will run this carefully," Amina said, "but be careful. If someone wanted James gone, they might come after anyone who pokes." Evelyn pressed the torn note from the violin case into Amina's hand and told her about the message at the funeral. Amina's face did not change with shock. It changed with steady calculation. "He left breadcrumbs," she said quietly. "Whoever did this underestimated him." They arranged a quiet plan. Amina would check surveillance, the ambulance paperwork, and the transfer logs. Evelyn would protect the ledger files, make copies, and keep the original hidden. She thought of the brass key again and took it from the bag, clicking it shut in her fist like a talisman. That night, Amina left with a promise, and Evelyn felt for the first time in days something like guarded hope. She went home and set up the small laptop with the hard drive from the bank box. The video file James had stored, in a folder labelled "If Gone," would not open at first. Her hands trembled as she worked through the passphrase James had used, the name of the town where they had married. On the first frame, James's face appeared, gaunt under a single lamp, hair unkempt, eyes dark with more than illness. He looked older than he had. He looked afraid. He spoke to the camera like a man confessing a sin. "Evie," he said simply, and the sound dissolved Evelyn into salt. "If you're watching this, I want you to know I love you. I had to make them think I was dead." He explained in clipped sentences that he had known about irregular transfers, that men in suits had been watching the company accounts, that when he refused to sign off an immoral contract, they'd made plans to remove him quietly. "Don't trust the man who ties smiles to money," James said, voice breaking. "If you see the name Vincent or Samuel, be very careful." The recording stuttered, then resumed. He looked off camera, and the colour left his face. The video cut with the sound of a door opening. Evelyn shut the laptop and pressed her forehead to the wood of the table. The house hummed with ordinary noise, a kettle, a distant car. But Madame Grief had been joined by a stranger that night. Fury. She vowed to protect what James had left. The ledger would not disappear. Someone had tried to make the world think James had been good at dying. Evelyn would make sure they were better at living with the truth. Evelyn slept badly, or not at all. Sleep felt like betrayal now. It would give thieves time to work. In the small hours, her phone buzzed. Amina's message was terse. Found a receipt linking transfers to a company registered at 9 Lancaster. Be careful. Midnight. She dressed with fingers that blurred, put the ledger folder into the coat that had once been James's, and went. The old station had a smell of stale smoke and paper, and Amina waited inside under a flickering light. She handed Evelyn a photocopy of a bank receipt with James's account number and an unfamiliar signatory. A man named Mercer. The name was new, but the signature line had a shaky familiarity. "Mercer is a fixer," Amina said. "He moves things so people don't see who's moving money." They compared notes, the funeral payments, the ledger, the broken CCTV. Amina's face grew harder. If they wanted James gone and to make it clean, they needed cooperation. From the funeral home. Maybe from the hospital. People who could make death a tidy word. As they spoke, Evelyn's phone buzzed again with an unknown number. She read the message while Amina's back was turned. "Stop looking or we'll finish what we started. No number. No signature." The threat felt like a knife sliding along the spine of the night. Amina folded the paper with the Mercer name into her folder and said aloud, "We file this. We leak parts to the press if we have to." Even as she spoke, a shadow passed the high window. For a second, both women felt watched. Then they heard a distant car and, more loudly, the click of a camera shutter in the dark. Someone had taken a photo of the station, and maybe of them. They left in different directions. Evelyn walked the streets with her hands in her pockets, thinking of James's laugh and how some treachery tasted like an expensive perfume that stuck. She passed the bakery where James used to stop and bought a stale croissant he would have complained about. The slice of normal wrapped the rest in strange colours. At home she found a smear of oil on the doorstep, enough to suggest someone had been there, leaving tidbits like a breadcrumb trail to scare her. Her heart pounded in a rhythm that had nothing to do with grief or relief. It was something feral. That night someone came close enough to leave a note tucked under her mat, a small rectangle of cheap paper. "We told you not to dig." The handwriting looked hurried. Evelyn held the slip until it softened from her heat, and then wrapped it in cling film and put it inside James's old tobacco tin. The threat should have scared her back under the warm quilt of the life she had known. Instead, it sharpened the edge of her resolve. James had planned for treachery. He had left the ledger. The message at the funeral had been a lifeline. Now the notes in her doorstep were a compass. They would not break her. They would show her the direction of those who wanted the world to move on without asking why. The days blurred into a small, brutal rhythm. Ledger, calls, a new receipt, the name Mercer cropping up like a bad weed. Evelyn and Amina worked in fits, copying pages, making calls, keeping their faces polite for the neighbours. One evening, as rain started soft on the window, a silhouette appeared at Evelyn's front gate. It was Jonah, her brother, face ruddy with worry. He pushed through the door and set his hat on the table without asking. "Evelyn, you're causing quite a stir," he said, trying to keep the subject light. "People are saying odd things." Evelyn could read him like an old map. Jonah had always been more comfortable with appearances than with truth. She watched him flinch when she told him about Mercer. He rubbed his temple. "You need to be careful what you say in public," he murmured. But Evelyn saw the quick cloud of shame pass across his face, as though he knew some things that had to be hidden. That night, Jonah slipped out to take a call in the yard. Evelyn's heart kicked. She had the ledger, yes, but there were other things. Small pieces of evidence that could be twisted if the wrong people whispered them into the right ears. She waited for Jonah to return, and when he did, his shirt seemed damp with rain and with something like remorse. He sat heavy across from her and said, "Evelyn, they offered help. They said they would make things easy." He pointed with a trembling finger at the ledger. "James left instructions about making things public, but—" He swallowed. "We had to keep the funeral quiet. The company. They said it would ruin the family if it got out." "You mean they paid Harold to keep records hidden?" Evelyn said. Jonah's eyes brimmed. "We were afraid. We thought James going peacefully would be better than the scandal." The room narrowed. "Who?" she asked. Jonah looked down and then up. "Vincent," he said, voice small as a coin. The name dropped like a stone into Evelyn's cup of tea. Vincent had always been polished and hungry in ways that made people uncomfortable. He had the easy ways of someone who believed the world owed him its best. The next morning, as Evelyn walked past Vincent's shop, a hand grabbed her arm. A woman she didn't know whispered, "Don't go anywhere near the old pier tonight." Her voice was thin with fear. Evelyn's appetite for answers burned brighter. She wanted to go to the pier, to Willow 17, where rust and salt had offered her small relief. Instead, she chose to go to the hospital where James had been treated. There, relieved clerks and a tired night nurse offered up a ledger of their own. The nurse's notes didn't match the funeral director's timeline. There was a 10-hour gap. Someone had moved James. That was when new dread settled like a stone in Evelyn's stomach. If James had been moved, then what she'd believed about the way he had passed was a lie arranged to make people look away. The nail in the coffin wasn't real. The coffin had been a stage prop. The scream over the phone fractured Evelyn into shards she had to gather quickly. "Mara!" she cried. The line buzzed, and then she could hear only the sound of someone sobbing and the jagged edge of a phrase, "He's gone." Evelyn drove through the wet streets as if someone else steered the wheel. When she arrived at Mara's house, the police were there, lights blinking like small accusations. Mara stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, the fatigue of sleepless nights etched into her face. The living room looked as if someone had flipped through it searching for secrets. Drawers were open. The small box where James's watch had been kept was empty. Mara's voice was a dry whimper. "They took him," she said. Her son's small bed was empty. She had left him asleep at Aunt June's house while they handled funeral matters, and now he was gone. Evelyn's world shifted like a table hit from underneath. The worst fears, once tidy and theoretical, now had teeth. "Who?" Evelyn asked, though she suspected the answer. Mara pointed an accusing finger toward a framed family photograph where Vincent smiled, arms around them both. "Vincent?" she said. "He was the last to visit. He said he'd take the boy to get bread and he never came back." Detectives swarmed. Amina's face was grim but controlled. She listened to every scrap of testimony with the patience of someone kneading dough. "We'll find him," she promised, though her own jaw had a hardness that spoke of limits. Vincent was nowhere to be found, and his phone went dead. Jonah's hands shook with the weight of the ledger in his pocket. He had not expected the family to be burned so quickly. The community's gossip became like a second skin. Itch, itch, scratch. People moving in the margins to see what would appear. As night fell and the search stretched thin into different neighbourhoods, Evelyn sat in the cold kitchen and tried to keep track of the names that had begun to orbit this calamity. Mercer, Samuel, Vincent, Harold. Each one had a shadow attached to them. She thought of James's last video again, the way he had looked at the camera with an apology in his eyes. She thought of the torn note, the key, the ledger. She thought of the message at the funeral. Someone had wanted them to be distracted. Someone had wanted her son taken because chaos makes erasure easier. Then, like a small sudden wound, a memory came of James in the kitchen years ago, telling a joke about the man who sells watches wound back to show older times. He had laughed, but the laugh had a brittle edge. He had said, "People will do anything for a comfortable story." Evelyn realised she had to make the uncomfortable story ring clear and loud. The search would not be just for her grandson. It would be for the truth that had been hidden beneath the neat rugs of polite lies. She rose and gathered her coat. The world had gone cruel, and the only weapon she had, apparently, was the ledger. With the police stretched thin, and the ledger making larger waves than Evelyn expected, she paid a private investigator named Leo out of her dwindling savings. Leo was a man who kept his files in neat envelopes and his eyes watchful. He smelled faintly of coffee and regret. He didn't promise miracles, only evidence. He began by following paper trails and watching accounts. The shell company Aurora was a ghost. Addresses that led to empty offices, directors who had moved on quietly, and transfers that wound around banks like a snake. Leo found a thread. A small transfer to a motel in the next town on the day James was moved. The motel clerk remembered a nervous man checking in that afternoon, paying cash and leaving early. A shaky pattern formed. Phone calls between Vincent and Samuel at odd hours, followed by payments to Harold's funeral account. Leo traced a call to a number registered to a small courier firm. The courier had made a delivery the morning before James's supposed death. When he followed the lead to the courier locker, the locker was empty, but the CCTV showed a man with a cap who, in the grainy footage, bore a suspicious resemblance to someone from the funeral. Harold's hands, perhaps, or Mercer's stance. Evelyn and Leo worked nights like conspirators rewriting a slow, mean history. Leo's presence was a small oasis of practical competence. He used a discreet camera to take a photo of Jonah walking into a bank, a photo that would later become a bargaining chip. He found that the same briefcase used by a Mercer in a corporate dinner the previous year matched the strap used to carry something too heavy into the hospital's service entrance. Each scrap of evidence was a small knife, They would not stab the conspirators, only cut the sugar coating from the top of their lies so the rotten underneath could be seen. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it felt. Leo's car tires were slashed one evening outside his flat. Someone left a note under Evelyn's pillow. "Stop, or we hurt the child." The letter smelled of cheap cologne. Evelyn folded it into the ledger and pressed it under the old tobacco tin. Fear turned their strategy from public confrontation to careful exposure. They began to leak small parts of the ledger to a trusted reporter, enough to rattle the men with clean suits, but not enough to let their prey flee. The pieces moved. One night Leo came to the house with a face that had lost colour. He had tailing photos of Samuel entering a bank vault at midnight with a key that matched the brass one Evelyn had found. The evidence stacked up like books on a shelf. One more book and the truth toppled. Evelyn sat with the photos and breathed like a woman who had been holding her breath for years. The ledger was no longer a private horror, it was a public tool. Now they only needed proof to make the men with smooth smiles show the cracks in their teeth. Mara's voice on the phone was a single, jagged thing. Evelyn felt a fury like a widening bruise. "Sign what?" she demanded, though she already guessed the answer. The estate papers that would make everything legal, move accounts and cover traces of transfers. They were a neat, lethal way of making the ledger irrelevant. Evelyn refused to be boxed into polite mourning. She refused to barter with the price of truth. They arranged a sting. Leo would get Vincent to think Mara was about to sign, while Amina and 2 uniformed officers awaited at the registrar's office. It was a dangerous gamble built on deception, but Evelyn thought of James's gaunt face in the video and the way he had told her to dig. All the small acts of courage mattered now. The morning was a tangle of nerves. Mara walked into the registrar's office, and Vincent followed straight behind, slick and sure. He smiled at Evelyn like a man who had practiced guilt to look like generosity. At the table, when Vincent reached for the stack of papers, he paused. Amina stepped out from behind a column with 2 officers. The room tightened like a fist. "We have reason to believe you were involved in unlawfully transferring funds and obstructing evidence," Amina said. Vincent paled, then blinked into anger. He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You have nothing," he snapped. His voice broke like glass when the laptop in the registrar's hand played a recording of his call arranging payments to Harold. Vincent's shoulders drooped. Behind him, a furious scuffle erupted. Samuel tried to push past an officer and one of the clerks screamed. For a heartbeat, it looked like the sting stood a chance. But as officers moved to restrain Samuel, a gunshot echoed from somewhere outside. A single shot that sent a flock of pigeons into the sky and caused everyone to freeze. The registrar's window cracked with the sound, and chaos spilled like water. In the confusion, Vincent bolted. He slipped past the officer who had his hand on his shoulder and dashed into a waiting car that roared away into the street. It was a small cinematic failure, the shot that saved one man's escape. Blood thrummed in Evelyn's ears. The child remained missing. The sting had proven that the men were guilty, and it had also shown how ruthless they could be when cornered. As Amina cursed the luck of the shot, Evelyn held the ledger and felt the weight of it like a chalice. They had proved enough to make people listen, but not enough to finish the job. The world remained crooked and dangerous. The men had resources and the knowledge that violence quiets even guilty consciences. The safe house was an anonymous bungalow on the edge of town, with curtains always drawn. Leo drove them there and parked 2 blocks away. They approached on foot like thieves. Evelyn's legs felt thin but strong. She held the ledger in a waterproof bag like a Bible. Inside, they found evidence of frantic packing. Suitcases, chocolate wrappers, a hastily doodled map. On a small kitchen table lay a child's jacket, the one Mara's son loved, with a patch of a dinosaur on the elbow. Evelyn's breath left her like wind from a blown-out candle. They moved carefully, room to room. In a bedroom closet they found a stack of passports, not James's. Photographs where Mercer, Samuel and Vincent appeared together, smiling into a camera at a wedding. The men were not as separate as they had claimed. The papers were a road of breadcrumbs to a man named Mercer, who had ties to a network that handled problems for wealthy clients. But the most cruel thing they found was a folded note with a child's drawing pinned to it. A crayon sun and the words, "I miss my Teddy." Underneath, in block writing, someone had scribbled, "Keep quiet or he won't come back." Evelyn's stomach hollowed. For all the ledger's menacing columns, for all the legal threads they were tugging, the danger was real and immediate. They found a phone in the house with one message: "Bring Ledger to Pier 9 at dusk or you never see him again." The number attached had been used once, then erased. It had the cold finality of a sealed fate. Evelyn's eyes stung. There was a public way to blow this wide open, release the Ledger copies to the press, and there was the private, immediate terror of a child in danger. Amina's face hard as flint. "We stage this. We go there and show them we have what we need. We do not go alone." Her voice was steady with the kind of command that had probably saved lives before. Evelyn looked at the ledger and at the child's jacket on the bed and felt the small, tremendous thing that lies at the centre of parents' courage. Nothing matters but the child. She called Mara to say she had found the jacket and held the line while her daughter sobbed, with a sound that was part relief and part anguish. Dusk folded the town in the colour of old coins. They moved toward Pier 9, not as heroes, but as battered people who had learned to walk with purpose. Under the greying sky, the pier groaned with the slow honesty of wood. The tide smelt like iron. There, a figure leaned against the rail, Mercer, cap low, cigarette dangling. Beside him, the child's small face peered from a car. He looked startled to see them, then guarded like a fox. Mercer's hands were clean, his smile practiced. "You shouldn't have come," he said, the words small and cold. Evelyn's heart stopped, and then began to hammer as if it were trying to escape. James stood there, gaunt in the half-light, wearing a jacket too big for his thin frame. It was not the picture from the easel in the chapel. It was him raw and alive, hair uncombed, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He looked older and more dangerous than the man she had known. For a moment, no one spoke. Sea air and the small cawing of gulls filled the gap. Mara's knees went weak and she clutched her child. The child blinked at his grandfather like the world had turned a page and found him where he should be. James's voice was quiet and brittle. "I'm sorry for the trouble, Evie," he said. It sounded like someone apologizing for a weapon they'd been forced to use. He explained, voice low and rushed, that he had been following the money and the men who had moved it. He had found evidence of collusion between certain local firms and offshore accounts draining the company. When he refused to sign off, men tried to silence him. He had faked his death as part of a plan to draw them into the open, to watch who moved what and who paid whom. The pier felt small and rickety under the weight of the confession. Evelyn wanted to fling herself at him, to grip the collar of the jacket and shake out of him every secret and every lie. But she also wanted desperately to trust. His hands smelled of sea spray and cigarettes, and for all his explanations he looked as if he had seen too much. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, voice thin. He looked away. "I couldn't risk you, Evie. They are dangerous." He smiled with the old crookedness she loved and then grew serious. "I didn't tell you because I thought I could handle it. I was wrong." Mercer, standing at the edge of this dangerous reunion, said nothing. He kept his cigarette like a little flag of mockery. The men who had arranged the ledger turned pale, then furious, their plans crumbling in the face of a man they didn't expect to survive. Vincent's name came up again. He had been part of the board that would have lost everything if the transfers were made public. Samuel was the man who took care of the books. Harold, the funeral director, had been the one who made the story cleaner for the press. Evelyn looked at James and felt the ache of the months rebuild into something like anger. He had nearly let the men run roughshod over their lives, but he had also saved them. He had risked everything to find them. The child, safe in Mara's arms, touched James's coat and smiled like a child who had been found in a dream. Evelyn felt the world tilt. All the pain and the ledger, and the black sedan and the threatening notes converged into one small, blindingly clear fact. She could not go back to the way things had been. She could not look at people the same way. James showed them the phone. His hands shook as he scrolled through a hidden folder labelled Truth. There, among shaky videos of whispered meetings and blurry faces, should have been an account of a call between Vincent and Mercer. Instead, the file stuttered, then went black. James swore it had been intact that morning. Evelyn felt the old, heavy, sick sensation of a dream being pulled away. Had someone managed to find the file and corrupt it? Had they been watched even in the moments of supposed safety? Leo took the phone with practiced hands and forced a file recovery program. The screen flooded with progress bars and hex code, a language of the desperate. Amina stood guard at the door, eyes like shuttered windows. The recovery limped along, revealing fragments. Vincent's laughter, a voice saying, "Clean up," then a cut, garbled breaths, and then a hissing silence. A small, obscene hitch in the plan. They had proof, but it was broken like a mirror with only shards to show a face. Then Evelyn noticed something small and impossible. A reflection in the glossy black frame of the phone in which, for a breath, someone else's face had appeared. A face with the angle and jaw of Mr. Granger, the family lawyer. Her chest compressed. Had Granger been the quiet hand arranging the neat legal edges? James's lips moved, producing a raw sound that was somewhere between laughter and sobbing. He had been trying to gather evidence that would not only name the criminals, but also bind them to their crimes in a way courts could not ignore. They needed an intact recording, and fast. The corrupt file suggested someone with tech skill and access had been inside their world. That meant there were players willing to scramble the digital traces. Leo traced the corruption to a local repair shop that had done a job for Harold's account last month. A man there, a technician with a nervous tic, had been paid cash. They followed the lead to a small flat where the technician, faced with the photos and the ledger, broke. He admitted being paid by a man in a suit to wipe a phone and told them where the man had been seen later, in a car that had passed by James's safe house twice the week before. Their world knit itself into a clearer and more terrifying pattern. The conspiracy reached further than they had suspected. It touched those who were meant to shield them. Evelyn felt the strain of betrayal like a rope pulled tight. She wanted to scream at the sky. Instead, she steeled herself. James had risked everything. Now they must make the evidence survive. They could not rely on fragile files. They needed witnesses and physical proof. They needed to force the men into a place where the law and the public eye would finish what their fragile file could not. Evelyn's hands shook when she walked into a local radio station clutching the ledger. A small, determined host named Clara listened to the tale with a compassion that had real teeth. Clara promised airtime. "If it's true, we'll run it tonight. If anyone tries to stop you, the town will know." The decision to go public felt like stepping off a cliff and trusting that something would catch you. That evening, the station hummed like a hive. A crowd gathered outside the glass window as the presenter introduced the story. Evelyn, James, Leo, and Amina sat at the table, mouths dry, hearts loud. As Clara read the ledger entries live, the town listened. The names, Vincent, Samuel, Harold, echoed in the ears of people who had once trusted them without question. Callers rang in, voices hoarse with disbelief and anger. On a bench outside the station, an older neighbour who'd always smiled at Evelyn's knitting sat with his head in his hands. The ledger unfolded in the public like a long, painful truth, revealed in broad daylight. The air tasted like electricity. Inside the station, a commotion rose as a man in a suit burst through the door. It was Granger, flushed and furious. He accused them of libel, of ruining reputations with allegations based on inadmissible documents. His voice was loud, and for a second the old world, polite, ordered, tried to stand. But as Clara pointed out details from the ledger, a new voice cracked through. A whistleblower from inside Aurora called in anonymously to corroborate wire transfers. The tide turned. The station's phones lit up with people who had noticed small things, a missing invoice here, an odd payment there. The pressure became public. The police had no choice but to act on the new urgency. A judge issued emergency freezes on the accounts linked to Aurora and a subpoena for records. Vincent, who had always thought his suits could keep him safe, felt the ground opening. Samuel was arrested trying to flee the country. Harold, cornered by receipts and testimony, confessed to taking payments. The world that had tried to smooth over James's death now convulsed under the weight of evidence. Evelyn felt numb relief and a fresh, sharp sorrow. The broadcast had not returned her husband to her arms forever, but it had dislodged the comfortable fiction some had built around the loss. The child came back to Mara safe, returned by a courier too frightened to be complicit anymore. They sat at the kitchen table and wept with a sound like water finding a bed. The ledger, once a secret weight, had become a lever. The men who had tried to buy silence found that the price of truth was lower than their courage. The law caught up with some of them, and others fled into the dark. The arrests were not the end, only a beginning. Trials stretched on and on like thin roads, but the small community watched as names that once slithered with impunity were read aloud in courtrooms. Vincent's face, once smooth and untouchable, showed the thin ferocity of a cornered animal. Samuel pleaded guilty to conspiracy and money laundering. Harold received a small sentence for his part. Mr. Granger's name turned out to be tangled in paperwork that showed his signature on transfers he later claimed he had not authorized. Paperwork, testimony, and the stubborn persistence of a grieving widow made the case. In the quieter moments when the cameras turned away to find fresher scandal, Evelyn and James tried to piece their lives back together. James's health was fragile from whatever horrors he had endured, but he had a stubbornness that matched Evelyn's own. They argued softly about the plan, the choices he'd made, the danger he had put them through. Evelyn forgave him in fits and starts. Forgiveness, she found, was a long and ordinary business. Mara rebuilt her life slowly, with the boys' laughter like a bell healing the rooms. The hardest truth arrived in an afternoon that smelled faintly of rain. Jonah, too, had been tangled in fear and small decisions. He testified in court, hands shaking, explaining how convenience and the desire to keep the family intact had led him to silence. His testimony was raw and full of shame. It also helped the case. The town learned how thin the line is between cowardice and complicity. People who had seemed kind showed their edges. Friends fractured, and townspeople argued. But in the rubble, a new honesty began to grow. A kind that was rough, but in its way honest. Evelyn stood one day at the pier where it had begun, fingers tracing the rail. She was no longer the woman who went to funerals and bowed her head with practiced grace. She had been remade by fear and by a long, bone-deep unfolding of truth. James stood beside her, thinner, his hand warm around hers. They had been through treachery and come out the other side with bodies still intact and spirit battered but breathing. The ledger had been a violent teacher, but its lesson was simple. Truth, once out, has a way of forcing the world to account for itself. The final verdict read like a small public apology. The judge's words carried weight, and the men were sentenced accordingly. Some of the money was recovered, some had flowed through hands too quick to catch. The town, slow to forget and slow to forgive, watched Vincent and Samuel escorted away in a way that made even the idle benches of gossipers feel chastened. Granger lost his license. Harold's sentence brought him years to think under the weight of his conscience. None of it returned the months or the fractured trust, but there was a kind of justice that felt practical and real, like bandages on a wound. Evelyn went back to the chapel not to mourn, but to give thanks in a new way. She stood at the foot of the same pulpit, the organ turning the same old hymns, and felt the room different because of her own different heart. People who had been silent came forward to apologize. Some apologies Evelyn accepted, others she held like fragile glass. She founded a small fund with recovered money to help families who had been wronged by corporate wrongdoing. It was small and modest, but it felt like a bridge. James started going to the market with a cane and a stubborn pride. He laughed in small, bright bursts and taught the child to fix a radio again. Their life was not what it had been, but it was a life with truth as its foundation. The last scene is simple. Evelyn and James on the porch at dusk, the neighbourhood awash of ordinary light. They hold hands and listen, to the neighbour's television, to the distant honk of a car, and to the slow, steady beat of a life that keeps going. They had survived deceit and fear, and the ledger lay in a sealed envelope in the town archives where it belonged. A record, a witness, a warning. Evelyn thought of the message that had come at the funeral and smiled a small, tired smile. "Trust no one," it had said. She had learned the hard truth behind those words, that not everyone deserved trust, and that trust, once earned, had to be guarded like a flame. But she had also learned that people could be braver than she expected, and that love, even when battered, could make the world tilt back toward justice. If this story touched you, if Evelyn's courage, James's risk, or Mara's fierce love moved something in your chest, please stay with stories like this. Subscribe so we can keep telling quiet, powerful tales of ordinary people who choose truth. Like the video if you felt the ache and the relief, and tell us in the comments, who in your life stood up when it mattered most? Sharing helps these small human stories find the people who need them. Thank you for listening, and for believing that truth can still change a life.